Right, part two. So I talked about the significance and potential of the bioeconomy. This section will focus on how to quantify the carbon benefits of the bioeconomy. As mentioned previously, the two inputs to determine carbon intensity are the total output of the production process, i.e. the yield, and the total emissions associated with production. These vary widely throughout the country. So what you're seeing here are the yield of corn crops measured by state here, and there's the average state yield in red, and the blue is the kind of the contest winner for yield production in that state. And you can see there's a significant difference between what the average is and what the yield is. And so what this implies is that there's a lot of opportunity and room for improvement in farm practices and decision making. And this is just based on yield, and it gets more complicated when you think about making the decision based on yield and perhaps carbon intensity. So I'll get into that in just a second. And when combined, we see that the national average, while a reasonable metric, given the lack of more detailed information, is not very representative when compared with state averages, especially when we account for the considerable variation within each state. And so if we were to connect actual farm payments that are, like I said, are based on national averages to carbon markets, just based on what we know on, the differences from state to state, and who knows how they vary, farm to farm, there would be some farmers that would be getting overpaid for their carbon services, and there would be farmers that are getting significantly underpaid. And so we know that there's these big differences, and we need to figure out how to, measure them more accurately. The primary driver of positive emissions is nitrogen. So what you can see here is this is looking at the sum of the emissions from feedstock production only, right? Like the farming practices. So nitrogen is the primary driver. If we could account for field level carbon intensity and connect that to carbon markets, there is a tremendous opportunity to promote the adoption of precision agriculture, for nitrogen management, and thus lower nitrogen related emissions. However, without financial incentives, there is no reason for farmers to adopt emissions reducing practices when under applying could lead to yield losses, right? Like if the only thing that a farmer gets paid for is yield, that is the thing that they must produce. They don't get paid for carbon because we don't have the ability to do it. And so there's perhaps some trade-offs in maximizing that yield. Now, because of the complexity of the growing dynamics of the nitrogen cycle, it is difficult to ensure that sufficient nitrogen is making its way to the soil. So it's easier, to simply over-apply than to attempt to get your application just right. As you can see on the far right, this insurance is cheap for the farmer, but it is costly for the environment. But it's not as easy as simply measuring nitrous oxide. The loss of applied nitrogen in the form of nitrous oxide is often dominated by a limited number of locations within a field and the environmental conditions during specific periods of the year. If these hot spots, if you will, characterized by topography, soil type, moisture, etc., and the hot moments, that are characterized by the fertilizer application, precipitation temperature, and those are displayed on the right-hand figure. If those are not properly monitored, measurements can produce estimates that undercount nitrous oxide emissions by as much as 80%. Measuring carbon intensity to reduce positive emissions is challenging, but it's essential, right? Especially if we want to realize the potential for carbon negative agriculture, The potential comes in the form of soil carbon sequestration. So, when people talk about carbon farming, they talk about, climate smart agriculture, they talk about soil health. They're talking about increasing soil carbon, but there's really two components in this. The thing that kind of makes the Smart Farm program stand out is that we are looking at all of the aspects that go into the total carbon intensity. You have to drive down the emissions above ground, through reducing nitrous oxide and energy use and resource inputs and those sorts of things, as well as implementing strategies to increase soil carbon below ground. There's been a huge surge in discussion about the potential for soils to sequester atmospheric carbon, and much of that discussion has been fueled by the growth in carbon markets developed specifically for agriculture. And this has also been on the minds of legislators. Here, the previous director of ARPA-E, Elaine Genetowski, is seen in the picture on the right bottom, talking to Marcy Kaptur, where she was asking specifically about the Smart Farm program. And unfortunately, the recent buzz around soil carbon tends to overlook some significant technical hurdles that must be overcome if soils are to present a viable carbon drawdown opportunity. Measurement is extremely difficult due to the variation in soils, which means the soil carbon is typically quantified over 5 to 10 years versus nitrous oxide, which is estimated on an annual basis. So in the production of biofuels, the ability to optimize nitrogen use efficiency is something that could get a farmer paid every year, but we would need to be able to connect that to the actual specific grain that was produced off that field. There's so much uncertainty regarding the ultimate fate of carbon sequestered in the soil, since changes in land management or the environment could result in it could result in a release of that stored carbon. So that can happen over time. And there's also a need to develop new tools for measuring soil carbon. Now, tools that will need to find the right balance of scale and resolution, such that there is a revenue positive path for all of those participating in the carbon market. And our ability to have both highly accurate field level data as well as landscape information, which can inform policymaking and regulatory markets, is essential. And some more of that field level data that can be connected to remote sensing is critical. So this is to say, supporting markets for connecting the price on carbon to agriculture is complex and requires a range of data to fill things out. And this is really important when we consider the role of agriculture and soils management in the context of other carbon removal strategies. While they're currently not available at the scale of soils and forests, things like direct air capture and direct ocean capture, mineralization, some of these other engineered approaches could be scaled to quite large levels, and could offer much longer storage times. So the dynamics with soil can present challenges to maintaining a higher value for the carbon market. To some, the two key drivers for net carbon accounting are nitrogen and carbon. An accurate measurement is essential to bring about practice change that could reduce emissions. Getting this accurate measurement means getting better data and having the financial incentive to capture it. Data certainty is one metric that will be critical for agriculture, for agriculture's participation in carbon markets, and it is tightly linked to the potential profits associated with reduced emissions. Here, we assume a high carbon price of $200 per ton, which is what the low carbon fuel standard credit prices are today. So that's an extremely optimistic scenario. But as you can see, as certainty declines, the per acre profits also decline. So for technologies farmers and the markets themselves to be viable, there needs to be an optimization of the measurement methods and the market incentives such that each participant stands to benefit. We were talking a little bit about this in the breakout session. Without better data, the ag sector will always be relegated to lower value carbon markets, because if you're going to be connected to very high value markets, people absolutely must know what they're paying to get. So you need to have that certainty. And it's important for farmers because this optimization becomes critical when we frame it in the context of the farmers, right? Who are managing, they're managing larger and larger farms while often operating in the red. And so, I think that there would be, a great opportunity for farmers to implement even more sustainable practices and practices that move things towards net negative emissions. But they need to have the economic certainty through better data in order to do that. And with all the decisions that farmers make, throughout the growing season, factoring in carbon intensity quantification is not going to happen without financial incentives. I mean, if you think about how many decisions they have to make to just maximize the yield, imagine the challenge of trying to make all these decisions when you're trying to balance the trade-offs of yield and carbon intensity at different prices, depending on what you're producing and so on and so forth. So it can be really tricky. Yet, the adoption of ag tech remains low. And we can see this today with the relatively low adoption rates for variable rate technology used for precision agriculture. And that is something that could, significantly reduce nitrogen application rates. And as we know, reducing nitrogen application rates to essential applications significantly reduces nitrous oxide release, which is the predominant, carbon equivalent emission for ag systems and farms. Low adoption rates have stifled development in agriculture hardware. And yes, there are tons of gadgets out there for farmers, but few are being adopted at significant scales because they are often fragmented and therefore limited in insight. Particularly for today's bandwidth constrained farmer, and they are rarely proven out in real world conditions. And I always find this statistic is really interesting. There's more people building stuff for farmers than there are farmers, and without some thread to actually better connect the need for new technology to new markets, i.e. like carbon markets, the adoption of new technology, by farmers, they're always going to be, somewhat skeptical of that. Now, meanwhile, the ag majors are focused on digital offerings that are geared toward improving yields. These digital offerings are important as they are the most scalable solutions, but there's, only so much that can be done with remote sensing, especially when it comes to, measurement in depth for soil carbon. There's a distinct need for in-field measurements to bring about the next generation of scalable solutions for carbon management. And so that's really the need that we have. And that brings me to, kind of what are the key financial incentives for low carbon agriculture. The ARPA-E Smart Farm program was conceived to unlock financial incentives in low carbon agriculture. Now, doing so requires measurement technology that can capture variation in field and operate in challenging environments. It also requires that the measurement technology produce reliable data that can instill market confidence and do so at a cost that ensures profitability to the grower or broker who adopts it. And the vision here was, if we could measure the carbon harvest. We can connect farm practices, I've said this again, to higher value carbon markets. Connecting farm practices to higher value carbon markets will incentivize innovation in new technologies, and it will then incentivize farmers to adopt those new technologies and practices to achieve greater outcomes because they can get paid for providing carbon management services. But the data that service, the measurements of these carbon harvests, if you will, need to be very reliable, very, very accurate, and very, very cheap. And so that is the challenge. That is the high risk, advanced research challenge for Smart Farm. And we wanted to, we kind of set up the program in two phases. The first one was to set a baseline and validate, and the second one was to develop commercial tools. So with the phase one baseline validation sites, we established a number of different sites throughout the country looking at various crops. On these sites, we will deploy the state-of-the-art technology to measure very accurately the above ground GHGs like nitrous oxide and below ground dynamics of soil carbon. And these sites will become the proving ground for the technologies that are produced in phase two, where they will be compared to the state of the art, and hopefully they'll be a lot cheaper and as accurate as the ones we have here. So the phase one teams are really tasked with capturing high resolution soil data and making the data available to the public. These sites will also serve as real world demonstration sites. And that will be for, as I said, that will be for phase two. Now, given the technical challenges for phase two, a portfolio approach was taken to ensure different methods of quantifying carbon intensity were explored. And this included perimeter approaches, drone measurement approaches, sensor networks, and also models that could be connected to these various sensor systems as well. These were the teams that we awarded. We had, two that are focused specifically on nitrous oxide. We have two that are focused specifically on soil carbon. And then we have a couple different, modeling teams that are going to be developing machine learning algorithms that can connect remote sensing data and in-field sensor data to provide a really robust, prediction and characterization of the components that go into quantifying carbon attributes, as well as potentially developing systems that would allow for a real-time decision support for farmers so that they can achieve those challenges I was saying are very difficult in all the decisions that they make are very complicated when they're just trying to optimize for yield, but now they will need to make even more decisions that optimize for both yield and carbon intensity, and hopefully these algorithms will help do that. So these technologies could enter markets on their own as validation tech. However, another key benefit of the phase one sites and phase two technologies is to offer ground truthing solutions for remote sensing applications. And remote sensing is, really kind of getting to be the holy grail, where you get to fly a satellite over a whole region, or like a high altitude aircraft to get information, or even a drone that can go over a whole bunch of different things. This could provide very low cost information if you could couple this to, ground truthing in, more direct networks of sensors that are in fields or in the soils. You could create a data environment that really provides the best outcome. So everything in black and brown is what we need to connect very scalable remote sensing data, and that is what Smart Farm is pursuing. So those are the components in black and brown. Those could theoretically be connected to remote sensing if we go to more satellite-based systems in the future. Finally, I want to talk quickly about phase three that we are potentially planning after the phase two, which would be a grand challenge. The idea with this grand challenge would be that, we would have teams come together, implement a number of different, technologies to obtain data that is necessary to quantify the carbon intensity of various crops that are going to be involved in the Grand Challenge. Their data would need to be verified, and so they'd be competing to make sure that their data matched with the ground truthing data that were available at our phase 1 gold standard validation sites. And then they'd be competing against one another to deliver that data, as well as real-time decision support tools for farmers at the lowest cost per acre. And that's what we would hope to envision, to kind of demonstrate the capacity for the integration of various data sets and remote sensing capabilities and decision support to offer really low cost, high resolution data, and also decision support to optimize all of these things at the same time, both yield and carbon. So with that,